Judge finds black woman, then learns truth that shocked everyone in a bustling courtroom. Tension hangs thick in the air. A black woman, calm yet resolute, stands before a judge who appears ready to make an example out of her. What starts as a routine case quickly spirals into a shocking moment that will leave the entire room stunned. The courtroom was bustling with activity. Lawyers shuffled papers. The faint sound of whispered conversations echoed through the chamber, and the judge sat high on his bench, radiating authority. The atmosphere was tense, but routine, the kind of day when cases rolled in and out without much drama. Until she walked in. A black woman entered, her posture upright and dignified, wearing a modest yet professional outfit. She held her head high, though her eyes betrayed the faintest flicker of exhaustion. It wasn't exhaustion from the day itself, but the weariness that comes from a lifetime of being scrutinized, judged, and underestimated. The judge glanced at her file, his face tightening ever so slightly. Without looking up, he announced her case: a minor infraction, perhaps a jaywalking ticket or a parking fine. But the way he spoke made it seem like she was standing trial for a serious offense. Miss Jones, he said, stretching her name as though testing its weight. It seems you've been ignoring the rules. We don't take that lightly here. The woman remained composed, her expression neutral. She nodded, ready to address the court, but the judge didn't let her. Let me make this clear, he continued, leaning forward slightly. In my courtroom, we follow the law, and when someone decides the rules don't apply to them, there are consequences. Do you understand? The tone was condescending, the kind of reprimand a teacher might give a wayward child. Several people in the gallery exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't just what he was saying, it was how he was saying it. His words were laced with implicit assumptions, his demeanor carrying an air of superiority. Yes, she replied, her voice steady but not submissive. The judge raised an eyebrow at her calm demeanor. Perhaps he expected defensiveness or contrition, but she gave him neither. He seemed irritated by her lack of reaction. Well, given your history of minor violations, he said, flipping through the papers in front of him, I'm issuing a fine, $200. A gasp rippled through the room. $200 or a minor infraction? Even the court clerk looked up from their notes, startled by the disproportionate penalty. The woman stood still, unflinching. She simply looked at the judge, her silence conveying more than words ever could. But the judge wasn't done. You should consider yourself lucky I'm not imposing a heart penalty, he added smugly. I'm being lenient. The woman's calm expression didn't change, but the tension in the room was palpable. Whispers spread among those seated. Some were shocked by the severity of the fine. Others murmured about how this wasn't the first time the judge had acted this way toward a black defendant. The judge, either oblivious or uncaring, sat back in his chair with a self-satisfied air. He tapped his gavel once, signaling the case was nearly concluded. The woman finally spoke. Your Honor, may I say something before we proceed? Her voice was polite but firm, a subtle power emanating from her words. The judge frowned, clearly irritated by her request. Make it quick, he and snapped, waving a hand dismissively, and with that the room leaned in, unknowingly bracing for what would come next as the woman stood silently, accepting the judge's ruling without protest. The tension in the courtroom shifted into something deeper. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about the unspoken layers of bias and injustice that had unfolded in front of everyone. The camera panned across the room. Faces of spectators and court staff revealed a range of emotions. Some seemed indifferent, others uncomfortable. A few exchanged knowing glances, as if silently acknowledging a pattern they'd seen far too often. The narrator's voice cut in. Instances like these are not uncommon. Black individuals in America often face disproportionately severe penalties for minor offenses, a reflection of systemic bias embedded in the justice system. While it may seem subtle to some moments, like these tell a much larger story, a montage of statistics and real-world examples filled the screen, each more troubling than the last graphs, showing racial disparities in fines and arrests flashed by, followed by clips of publicized cases where minor infractions had escalated into life-altering events. For Black individuals, the narrative paused to highlight the humanity of the woman standing in court. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about a person who had likely faced a lifetime of being judged not by her actions but by her skin. The scene transitioned back to the courtroom. The judge, still oblivious to his own biases, maintained his stern demeanor, speaking down to the woman as though she were incapable of understanding the gravity of her crime. His tone was patronizing, each word dripping with an authority that came from years of unchecked power. The narrator continued, "This isn't just about one case or one judge, it's about the power dynamics at play in a system where unconscious biases can lead to conscious injustice, a system where being Black often means being presumed guilty or less deserving of fairness." The camera lingered on the woman's face, her expression unwavering. Despite the blatant unfairness of the situation, the quiet strength in her posture spoke volumes, a stark contrast to the arrogance emanating from the bench. At this point, the audience in the gallery began to react more openly. A man in the back shifted Eid uncomfortably, muttering under his breath about the unfair fine. A young woman with a notebook, likely a reporter, scribbled furiously, as though realizing the story was bigger than she'd anticipated. The woman at the center of it all remained calm, her hands clasped in front of her. Her silence wasn't submission, it was patience. She was waiting, biding her time. It was clear she had something to say, something that would change everything. As the murmurs in the room grew louder, the judge banged his gavel, again demanding order. But even as the room quieted, the tension didn't dissipate. Instead, it hovered thick and oppressive, a weight everyone could feel, but no one dared to address. The narrator's voice returned. In this moment, the true stakes of the case were laid bare. This wasn't just about a fine, it was about dignity, fairness, and the unspoken challenges Black individuals face every day. What would come next would challenge everyone's assumptions and force them to confront the reality of racial bias in the justice system. And with that, the camera cut to the woman, who raised her head slightly, preparing to speak. The room seemed to hold its breath, sensing that whatever she said next would change everything. The judge leaned back in his chair, his hand gripping the gavel with a sense of finality. His expression was one of smug authority, as though he had rendered the kind of justice that would teach this woman a lesson. Next case, he called out, signaling to the clerk to move on, but the room was far from ready to shift focus. The woman, still standing at the defendant's table, raised her hand slightly. "Your Honor," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the murmurs that filled the room. "I'd like to clarify something before we proceed." The judge's face tightened. He glanced at her, then at the clock on the wall, his impatience clear. "Miss Jones, I've already made my ruling. If you wish to contest it, you can file an appeal, otherwise pay the fine and be on your way." But she didn't move. Instead, she stood her ground, her voice steady, but now with a touch of steel beneath the surface. "With all due respect, Your Honor, it's important that I be allowed to speak." Her tone wasn't argumentative or disrespectful, yet it carried an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. A ripple of curiosity spread through the courtroom. People leaned forward, their eyes darting between the woman and the judge. The judge sighed audibly, his frustration barely masked. "Fine, but make it brief." He waved a dismissive hand, as though granting her permission to speak was a mere courtesy. The woman adjusted her stance, standing taller, her presence suddenly commanding attention. She locked eyes with the judge, her voice unwavering as she began to speak. "Your Honor," she said, "I've spent my entire life understanding how this system works. I've studied it, practiced within it, and even worked to improve it. What happened today is a symptom of a much larger problem, a problem I've dedicated my career to addressing. The room went silent. Gone was the quiet, unassuming demeanor. In its place was someone who seemed to tower over the proceedings, not with volume, but with undeniable authority. The judge's brow furrowed, confusion flashing across his face. What exactly are you saying? He asked, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. What I'm saying, Your Honor, is that your ruling reflects a bias, perhaps unconscious bias, but bias nonetheless. A bias that assumes because of my appearance that I am less capable, less respectable, or less deserving of fair treatment. Her words hit the room like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the gallery and the judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I'm not just someone standing before you today for a minor infraction, she continued, her gaze unwavering. I'm someone who has spent years as an advocate for justice. I've worked on cases that reached the highest levels of the law, and while you saw fit to issue me an exorbitant fine, you failed to ask the most important question: who am I? Really? The judge stared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and unease. The once dismissive tone in his voice was gone now. He simply asked, "And who are you, Miss Jones?" The pause that followed was electric. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, waiting for her response. Even the court clerk stopped typing, their fingers hovering over the keys. Her answer would soon unravel everything the judge thought he knew, setting the stage for a reckoning unlike anything he'd ever faced. The room was silent, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls and made every creak of a chair or rustle of paper sound deafening. All eyes were on the woman as she took a deliberate breath and prepared to answer the judge's question. I am, she began, her voice clear and measured, a graduate of one of the top law schools in this country. I've argued cases in courts far higher than this one, and more importantly, I've spent my career fighting for justice, not just for myself, but for people who, like me, have been underestimated, mistreated, and judged unfairly because of the color of their skin. The words landed like a thunderbolt. There was an audible gasp from someone in the back of courtroom. A man who had been leaning lazily against the wall stood up straighter, his eyes widening in shock. The reporter in the front row dropped her pen, scrambling to pick it up. As she furiously took notes, the judge blinked, the confidence in his eyes faltering for the first time. You're an attorney? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Not just an attorney, she continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. I'm a legal strategist, a consultant for civil rights organizations, and an advisor on reforming systems of injustice just like the one we're standing in today. The judge leaned back in his chair, visibly uncomfortable now, his face flushed as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a routine case. This wasn't just another defendant. I didn't think it was relevant, she said, her tone sharp, because my credentials shouldn't determine how I'm treated in this courtroom or any courtroom. The fact that you saw fit to fine me so heavily for such a minor infraction says more about your assumptions than it does about me. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, but no one dared to interrupt her. I could pay the fine right now, she continued, her eyes locked on the judge. It wouldn't impact me financially, but that's not the point. The point is that if I didn't have the education, the resources, and the privilege of being able to stand here and speak for myself, I might have been forced to accept your ruling without question. And that's what happens to countless people who look like me every single day. Her voice rose slightly, not in anger, but in determination. That's why I fight. That's why I speak up. Because this system, your system, has to change. The judge's gavel resting on his desk seemed to mock him now, a symbol of authority that no longer felt unshakable. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. Miss Jones, he faltered, unsure of what to say. But she wasn't done. Your Honor, she said, her voice softening, but losing none of its power this moment. isn't just about me, it's about accountability. It's about recognizing how deeply embedded biases can shape decisions even when we don't realize it. The judge opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out. He looked out over the courtroom, seeing the sea of eyes watching him, judging him in the way he had so often judged others. For the first time, he seemed small. The courtroom was utterly still, the kind of stillness that made every breath audible. The judge sat frozen, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, pride battling with embarrassment, authority grappling with humility. The woman's words had not only pierced the courtroom's atmosphere, but had reached something deeper within everyone present. Spectators exchanged glances, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and discomfort. A man in the back row whispered, "I can't believe she just said that," and a young LW clerk at the side of the room scribbled furiously in her notebook, her expression a mix of admiration and shock. The judge finally spoke, his voice more measured now, but still tinged with defensiveness. "Miss Jones," he paused, looking down at that reminded us all of the power of truth, the importance of courage, and the need for change. Justice isn't automatic. It's something we must demand, protect, and build together. Do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better. Stand against injustice. Speak up for equality. Together, we can create a world where fairness isn't just an ideal, but a reality for all.